This episode contains discussions of violence, murder, torture, trauma, grief, isolation, vigilantism, organized crime, psychological manipulation, corruption, survivor's guilt, and death. Listener discretion is advised. The storm never really leaves people like Oliver Queen. Even after the island, even after the scars, even after the hood, it stays with him. Because survival changes people in ways nobody warns you about. Not all at once, and not in some dramatic moment where the hero rises from the ashes stronger than before. Real survival is quieter than that. Slower. It settles into the bones, into the silence between conversations, into the nightmare that wakes you long after the danger has already passed. Before the masks, before the arrows, before Star City whispered his name like some myth criminals told each other in dark alleyways, Oliver Queen was exactly the kind of man nobody expected to become a savior. He was reckless, privileged, lost in a life built around parties, money, and the illusion that consequences only happen to other people. Then the storm came for him. Not just the ocean, not just the island, the storm inside people. The part born from fear, rage, guilt, and desperation. The part of the world capable of turning survival into something brutal. Somewhere between the blood, the isolation, and the years spent fighting to simply survive, Oliver learned the truth that most heroes spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Sometimes survival demands becoming something unrecognizable, because Oliver Queen did not return home as the man who disappeared. He came back carrying scars nobody around him could fully understand. He returned as a weapon sharpened by trauma, grief, and impossible choices. A man trying desperately to save a city while barely holding on to himself long enough to do it. And that is what makes Oliver Queen dangerous. Not the arrows, not the training, not even the hood itself. It is the constant war happening underneath everything else. The war between the man who wants to believe people can still be saved and the survivor who knows what monsters are capable of when the lights go out. Every rooftop, every fight, every name crossed off a list became another attempt to convince himself that the suffering meant something, that all the pain, all the death, all the years he'd lost could somehow become part of something better. But storms do not disappear simply because the skies grow quiet for a while. They wait. They linger beneath the surface. And for Oliver Queen, the hardest battles were never fought against criminals, assassins, or corrupt men hiding behind power. They were fought in the quiet moments where he had to ask himself whether there was still enough humanity left inside him to survive becoming the arrow. Sometimes the storm outside eventually passes, but the one inside you never does. Welcome back to After the Storm, the series where we explore the survivors left standing after trauma, catastrophe, grief, and impossible choices reshape who they are. This is not a show about perfect heroes or simple redemption stories. It is about people who carry scars long after the battle ends. People still trying to figure out who they became while surviving the worst moments of their lives. And tonight, we're talking about a man who built himself into a weapon because he believed pain was the only thing strong enough to save his city. A billionaire heir, a castaway, a vigilante, a symbol, a ghost haunting the rooftops of Star City. This is the story of Oliver Queen. Because Oliver's journey was never really about becoming a superhero. It was about survival, about what happens when isolation strips away every comfort, every illusion, and every excuse until it all remains is the raw question of who you truly are underneath everything else. The island did not create Oliver Queen from nothing. It exposed every weakness, every fear, every darkness he spent his old life trying to outrun. And when he finally came home, he discovered something even more terrifying than survival itself, trying to live with what survival turned him into. Over the course of the episode, we'll explore Oliver's transformation from reckless heir to broken survivor, the psychological cost of vigilantism, the burden of leadership, the people who kept him anchored to his humanity, and why his story becomes one of the most emotionally tragic journeys in modern superhero television. Because beneath the arrows, the masks, and the mythology surrounding the Green Arrow, Oliver Queen was always just a man standing in the middle of a storm, desperately trying not to drown in it. This is After the Storm. To understand who Oliver Queen became, you first have to understand who he was before the island stripped everything away from him. Because the tragedy of Oliver Queen is not that he was born broken. It's that he was born comfortable enough to never realize how unprepared he truly was for the world waiting outside of his bubble. And when the storm finally came for him, it came all at once. Before he became the Arrow, before the Hood, before the scars, the mission, the endless war against corruption, Oliver Queen was exactly the kind of man most people would never expect to become a hero. He was privileged, reckless, self-destructive. The son of billionaire Robert Queen, Oliver grew up surrounded by wealth, luxury, and the kind of insulation that protects people from consequences. Star City knew him less as a future leader and more of a tabloid headline waiting to happen. Parties, scandals, expensive mistakes, broken relationships. Oliver drifted through life without direction because deep down he never truly believed anything could touch him. And that illusion is important. Because Oliver's story is not about someone born noble rising naturally into heroism. His story begins with avoidance, with emotional immaturity, with someone running from responsibility for so long that responsibility eventually arrived like a tidal wave determined to drown him. When the Queen's Gambit sank, it did more than strand Oliver on an island. It destroyed the entire foundation of who he thought he was. One moment he was living the life of a careless rich kid. The next, he was surrounded by death, isolation, and survival in the rawest possible form. And survival does not care about privilege. The island forced Oliver into a reality where money meant nothing, status meant nothing. The charming personality he used to hide behind meant nothing. Hunger mattered. Pain mattered. Violence mattered. Staying alive mattered. Everything else disappeared. That is the moment where the real transformation began. Not when he picked up a bow. Not when he pulled on the hood. Not when people started calling him a vigilante. The transformation began the first time Oliver realized nobody was coming to save him. Over the years spent stranded away from civilization, Oliver was shaped by trauma after trauma. Every fight, every betrayal, every loss carved something new into him. The island became less of a location and more of a psychological furnace, something designed to burn the weakness out of him, whether he survived the process or not. And the terrifying thing is that it worked. Because the Oliver Queen who eventually returned home was stronger, smarter, deadlier, and more disciplined. But because he was also emotionally fractured in ways the people around him could barely comprehend, he came back carrying survivor's guilt, carrying violence, carrying fear, carrying the constant belief that if he stopped fighting for even a moment, everything around him would collapse again. The island taught Oliver how to survive. But survival and healing are not the same thing. And for the rest of his life, Oliver Queen would struggle to understand the difference. When Oliver Queen returned to Star City, People saw a survivor. What they did not see was the damage survival had already done to him. Because trauma rarely announces itself openly. Sometimes it hides behind purpose, behind discipline, behind the illusion of control. And for Oliver, the hood became more than a disguise. It became armor, not just against criminals, but against himself. The first version of Oliver Queen that Star City encountered was not a hero. He was angry, focused, ruthless, obsessed. When Oliver began operating as the Hood, his mission was driven by something deeply personal, his father's list, a collection of names tied to corruption, greed, organized crime, and the decay poisoning Star City from the inside out. To Oliver, the mission initially felt simple. Punish the guilty, eliminate the threat, save the city by force if necessary. But vengeance always disguises itself as justice in the beginning. That is what makes it seductive. Because when someone survives unimaginable trauma, violence can start feeling logical, necessary even. Especially when the world around you appears rotten beyond repair. Oliver convinced himself that crossing lines was acceptable because he believed the mission mattered more than his own humanity. And for a while, it worked. Criminals feared him. Corrupt people vanished overnight. The city whispered stories about a monster hunting predators from the shadows. But every arrow carried consequences. One of the most fascinating parts of Oliver Queen's evolution is watching him slowly realize that fear alone cannot save a city. The Hood operated like a weapon, efficient, brutal, emotionally detached. But the deeper Oliver descended into violence, the more isolated he became from everyone trying to reach him. Diggle saw it. Felicity saw it. Laurel even saw it. The mission was consuming him. Because vigilantism creates a dangerous psychological trap. The more responsibility Oliver placed on his own shoulders, the more he began viewing himself as the only person capable of protecting Star City. Every failure became personal. Every death became another wound he carried privately. Every enemy became proof that he could never truly stop fighting. And that kind of thinking destroys people. And underneath all the strength, Oliver was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of losing people. Terrified that the monster he became on the island was not temporary at all. That fear almost shaped every relationship in his life. Oliver constantly pushed people away, because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risking losing all over again. Even when he loved people dearly, part of him believed his darkness would eventually destroy them too. So he kept carrying everything alone. The guilt, the violence, the responsibility. And over time, the Hood slowly transformed into something else entirely. Not because Oliver suddenly stopped being angry, but because the people around him forced him to confront a difficult truth. A city cannot be saved by vengeance forever. Eventually, if you want people to believe in something better, you have to become something better too. And that's the realization is what truly began transforming Oliver Queen into the Green Arrow. Not perfection, not redemption, choice. The choice to keep fighting without completely losing himself in the process. The hardest part of surviving trauma is not learning how to fight. It's learning how to let people close enough to help carry the weight of it. And for Oliver Queen, that may have been the battle he struggled with the most. Because somewhere beneath the hood, beneath the mission, beneath all the violence, was still a man terrified of losing the people he loved. For all the mythology surrounding Oliver Queen, one truth remains painfully constant throughout his story. He never survived alone, even when he tried to. That is the part of what makes Oliver such a compelling character. Beneath the image of the lone vigilante standing over Star City with a bow in his hand is someone desperately dependent on the people around him emotionally, whether he wants to admit it or not. Every major stage of Oliver's life is defined by relationships that either pull him towards humanity or pushed him deeper into darkness. And because of the trauma he carried, Oliver often struggled to tell the difference. The island taught him survival through isolation, through emotional suppression, through violence. But real life, after returning home, demanded something else entirely different. Trust, vulnerability, connection. The exact things Oliver had spent years training himself to avoid. That contradiction haunted nearly every relationship he had. Laurel Lance represented the life Oliver lost before the island. She was tied to the version of himself that still believed things could be simple, honest, normal. But guilt poisoned much of their relationship from the beginning. Oliver carried the weight of betrayal long before the Queen's gambit ever sank. And after returning home, every interaction with Laurel became layered with grief, regret, and the crushing awareness that survival had changed him into someone she had barely recognized. Then there was John Diggle. In many ways, Diggle became Oliver's moral anchor, the man willing to challenge him when no one else would. Diggle saw both the survivor and the damage underneath him, and unlike many people around Oliver, he refused to blindly accept the justification that the mission had excused everything. Their relationship mattered because Diggle constantly forced Oliver to confront the line between justice and obsession. And then there's Felicity Smoke. Felicity brought something into Oliver's life that he genuinely did not know how to process at first. Hope. Not the fantasy version of hope superheroes talk about in speeches, but something quieter and more personal. Warmth. Safety. The possibility that maybe he did not have to spend the rest of his life drowning in guilt and violence alone. That terrified him. Because for Oliver Queen, love came attached with fear. The fear of loss, fear of failure, fear that anyone close to him would inevitably suffer because of the life he chose to live. Over and over again, Oliver tried to protect the people around him by creating emotional distance, convincing himself that isolation was somehow noble, when in reality it was just often survival instinct disguised as sacrifice. And the tragedy is, he was not entirely wrong. People around Oliver did suffer. Friends died. Relationships collapsed. Trust fractured repeatedly under the pressure of secrets, trauma, and impossible choices. That constant cycle reinforced the belief already buried deep inside him that his life was something dangerous, something corrosive, something capable of destroying the people he loved the most. But despite it all, the people around Oliver never fully stopped reaching for him, and that matters. Because the Green Arrow was never built by Oliver Queen alone. He was shaped by every person who reminded him that survival without humanity eventually becomes emptiness. Diggle reminded him of honor. Felicity reminded him of hope. Laurel reminded him of consequence. Even his enemies often reflected parts of himself he desperately feared becoming completely. And slowly, painfully, Oliver began learning something the island could never have taught him. Strength is not measured by how much pain you can endure alone. Sometimes, strength is allowing yourself to need other people despite knowing they might hurt you, leave you, or disappear someday. For a man shaped almost entirely by loss, that may have been the bravest thing Oliver Queen ever learned how to do. Every survivor eventually reaches a moment where they have to confront one terrifying question. Was all the suffering worth it? For Oliver Queen, that question followed him for years. Because the deeper his mission grew, the larger his consequences became. The hood evolved into the arrow evolved into a symbol, and somewhere along the way, Oliver stopped fighting only for survival, and he started fighting for legacy. One of the most powerful aspects of Oliver Queen's story is that it never allows him to remain static. He evolves constantly, painfully, and often unwillingly. The angry survivor who first returned from the island, believing violence alone could save Star City, slowly transformed into something far more complicated. A leader carrying the weight of an entire city's hope on his shoulders. And hope is heavy, especially for someone who spent most of his life expecting loss instead of peace. As Oliver embraced the identity of the Green Arrow, the mission stopped being about punishment alone. It became about responsibility, about protecting people rather than simply hunting enemies. But that shift came with an enormous emotional cost, because leadership forced Oliver into a role, and that security stayed with him. No matter how many people he saved, no matter how many battles he survived, or how many times he sacrificed himself for others, part of Oliver always remained trapped in the mindset of a broken man who stepped off that island believing he was fundamentally damaged beyond repair. That internal conflict is what separates Oliver Queen from many traditional superhero narratives. His story is not about someone effortlessly becoming a symbol people admire. It is about someone repeatedly failing, hurting people, making impossible decisions, and still continuing to fight despite believing he may never fully redeem himself. And that makes his sacrifice feel human, because Oliver sacrificed constantly. He sacrificed relationships, peace, normalcy, pieces of his identity. Over time, the mission consumed nearly every aspect of his existence. The Green Arrow stopped being something Oliver did and became something he was. And while people around him often tried to help him separate the man from the symbol, Oliver struggled deeply with that distinction. Somewhere deep down, he believed his value came from protecting others, even if destroyed pieces of him. And that belief ultimately defines his legacy. By the end of his journey, Oliver Queen had become more than a vigilante hunting the rooftops. He became a symbol for resilience for a city that spent years drowning in corruption, violence, and the fear. But symbols are complicated. The people who become them often pay enormous personal price long before history remembers them as heroes. Oliver paid that price repeatedly. What makes his ending resonate emotionally is not simply the sacrifice itself. It is the understanding that Oliver spent his entire life fighting against the darkness, both outside and inside himself. Every enemy, every tragedy, every loss forced him to confront pieces of his own trauma over and over again. Yet despite everything, despite the exhaustion, despite the grief, despite the reasons he had to stop fighting, he kept choosing people. He kept choosing his city, his family, his team, hope, and that choice matters. Because Oliver Queen's story was never really about perfection. It was about endurance, about carrying pain without allowing it to completely erase your humanity, about surviving storms that should have destroyed you and still finding reasons to protect others from standing in the rain beside you. And maybe that's why his story is connected to so many people. Not because Oliver Queen was flawless, but because he wasn't. He was wounded, angry, fearful, self-destructive, compassionate, determined, human. And in the end, that humanity became stronger than the storm that created him. And maybe that leaves us with the real question surrounding Oliver Queen. How much of yourself can you sacrifice before you stop recognizing the person underneath the mission? Because Oliver Queen spent years trying to save Star City while fighting a war inside himself at the exact same time. A war between vengeance and justice, between isolation and connection, between survival and humanity. And despite every scar the storm left behind, he kept getting back up and choosing to fight for the people anyway. Not because he believed he was perfect, but because he believed the city deserved someone willing to stand between it and the darkness. And honestly, maybe that's what makes Oliver Queen's story resonate deeply with people. Not the arrows, not the mask, not even the mythology surrounding the Green Arrow. It's the idea even broken people can still become symbols of hope. Thank you for listening to After the Storm. If you enjoyed tonight's episode on Oliver Queen, there are more storms waiting ahead, more survivors, more tragedies, more people trying to figure out who they became after the world changed them forever. And remember, sometimes surviving the storm is only the beginning. If you liked Oliver Queen, check out my other shows. The links are in the episode description. I also appreciate if you check out our other shows from our little group like Fandoms and Hey Anime and let them know I sent you.